Hi everybody, I'm Dr. David Granite, and welcome to Health Matters. It's estimated that up to 66% of the American population is currently overweight or obese. If you're not talking about it right now, you probably were just a few minutes ago. And recently, there's been a new study that talks about the influences of the environment, your friends and your family, I'm going to talk about which is more important, on how you look and how much weight you have. To help us get through this, we have the author of that study, Dr. James Fowler, who's an associate professor of political science. And we'll point out that his doctor is a PhD, what we call a real doctor. And we also have Dr. Mike Gottschalk, who is a professor of pediatrics and chief, or el jefe, of pediatric endocrinology here at the University of California, San Diego as well. And we have you both here because this crosses disciplines into affecting everyone. Well, we've been talking about it before we started the show. Everywhere you turn, there is something about the study that you guys recently did, and it's just amazing, looking at the social network and how that can affect weight. Can you give us a quick summary, and then we'll delve into some of the details?
Sure. So we got some data from the Framingham Heart Study, which is this really long-running study. It started actually in the late 1940s. And we've learned a lot of what we know, for example, about the relationship between heart disease and smoking from this study. And so this study is going on today, even still. And starting in the 1970s, the study started keeping records on people's friends and family. And so we actually got a grant to map the social network of the people in this study so that we could see who was friends with whom and what family members people had in the study. And because it was such a small group there in Framingham, a lot of these people connected up to one another so that we could see the influence of one person's weight gain on another person's weight gain.
Well, you say small, but it's like 12,000 people.
Yeah, 12,000 people. What I mean by small is it wasn't a study of people all around the country. It was a single community, so that when people mentioned who their friends were, they were also likely to be members of the study.
And you had information about how much they weighed.
Absolutely. Again, this is a gold standard study, and they actually had doctors weigh them every 2 to 4 years. And so we looked across 7 different exams, 32 years, to see what happened as one person gained weight to their friends and to their family. And what we found was really stunning. We thought we would find something, but we didn't realize the effects would be so large. We found that if your friend becomes obese, it increases your own risk of obesity by 57%.
But what if your family member is obese?
Also, we found that if your siblings become obese, it increases your risk by 40%, and if your spouse becomes obese, it increases your risk by 37%.
See, I'm still shocked by that, because it would seem to me that your spouse, who you're with every day, would have more of an impact on you than a friend, but it was not that way.
It's funny you should mention that, because when we first started doing the modeling, we looked at that result and we thought, nobody is going to believe this. That, my wife, she has less influence on me. She's,
I mean, heck, my wife makes the meals.
That's right. That's right. Or sometimes the husbands make the meals. So, but spouses, they spend a lot of time together. And so we looked more carefully at the friendship data and the sibling data. And what we found in that data is that same-sex relations were much more important than opposite-sex relations. So men apparently look to men, and women look to other women more than to members of the opposite sex. And so while spouses spend a lot of time together and on average are really good friends with one another, they're also members of the opposite sex. And so those two factors sort of work against one another.
And my wife told me that many years ago, that she doesn't dress for me or the other men, she's dressing for the women. Because
right.
They all look at each other, so it made sense to me because I'd been educated on that aspect already. Now, when you heard the results of this as a clinician dealing with weight issues, especially in children, were you surprised, or did you expect family relationships to be more important?
Well, I think with children, we're a little bit more of a unique situation because the parents and the family have a tremendous influence on the child. For example, the parents buy the food, the child doesn't have access to it. So some of the decision-making that goes on in terms of lifestyles are really controlled still by parents. But we were surprised because I think this is a novel paradigm that really hasn't been explored before. And as we're trying to go forward in trying to prevent obesity, as well as potentially come up with regimens to treat obesity, you really have to understand what are all the variables and potential barriers and what's driving this. And if we don't understand that, then no matter what we come up with a scheme, we're not going to be very successful with.
And I mean, some of the impacts on this, I was thinking about as a physician on trying to impact someone to get them to start an exercise program or something. And one of the things that was, I think, the most powerful effect in the study that you wrote was if two people said each other were friends, the numbers skyrocketed on the effect.
Absolutely. So these forms that we collected the information from ask people to name a close friend who will know where you live 2 to 4 years from now. And so we had 3 different kinds of relationships. So I could name you as a friend, so we could see your effect on me, or my effect on you, or we could both name each other as a friend. And it makes sense that if we name each other as a friend, that's probably evidence of a stronger relationship. And we found there a much, much stronger influence between mutual friends than between friends where only one of the person named the other person. The other really interesting thing, in these association studies, we rarely have evidence of causality. But what we found was, if I name you as a friend and you become obese, it increases my risk of obesity, but not the other way around. So this is just an effect of people that we esteem, people that we name as friends. You may be sort of blissfully unaware of my existence if I name you as a friend, right? And then I'm not going to have an impact on you. And so the fact that the influence seemed to flow in one direction is, we think, really strong evidence of causality.
Which is amazing. And again, going back to the actual now, putting that into effect, I'm thinking about trying to change someone's behavior, and you're talking to them in the office, but their friend's obese. And the friend's not sitting there with you. And that friend has a very powerful effect. It almost changes the paradigm.
It does, and I think we were talking before, really one of the questions comes is how does influence occur? Is it that the person is looking for acceptance of the change in their weight, and they're going to be satisfied with the fact that they're gaining weight and not want to make a change? If their friends, though, perceive it that that's not what should be happening, then trying to get them to influence the change is going to be really important. And so it becomes difficult, though, because you can't get friends over distances to maybe go to the gym unless they have a webcam and they can show each other
Right.
exercising at the same time. But I think there are other strategies that you can evolve within sort of local friends and close friends. And some of that has already been done, because you look at, there's a TV show in which they try to get everybody to lose weight at the same time, and they make it a competition. There are organizations where, at work, they said, okay, we're going to lose, as a group, we're going to lose 80 pounds. And so I think there's very social networking going on, and that's how there's sort of this pull and tug that you can bring people along together and be maybe more effective than trying to just look at individual in isolation.
Absolutely.
Well, that's an interesting way to discuss even spending money from a public health standpoint, is influencing the social network at a workplace rather than the individual in front of you.
No, absolutely. And another interesting thing about the study, because we had these maps of the social network, we not only knew what was happening between friends, but between friends' friends. So you may have a friend, and I don't know that person. And if you and I are close friends, that person's weight also affects my weight. In fact, it extends to your friends' friends' friends, 3 degrees of separation into the network. And so people that you've never met, you have an influence on them, and they have an influence on you.
Somehow, whenever I drop my son off at school, elementary school, there are all these people who are in their workout clothes. I mean, you start to see, I looked at the world differently after reading your report and looking at these influences that are all around us of who we respect and who we are friends with and what they look like, in a way that I never would have before, and especially in the application to medicine. I still find it amazing what you found.
No, it's interesting because we found the what, but we still don't know the why. Right, so there's this association. It does appear to flow in one direction. But why is it the case? Is it because of acceptance of larger body sizes over time? Is it because of shared norms about eating, shared norms about exercise? Those are things that we really need to explore in order to be able to give better advice on what these interventions should be when you get your friends and family involved in your own health behaviors.
And we clearly want to start this early. I mean, we want people to have good behavior early. You're involved with the PACE program.
Correct.
Could you tell us a little bit about that?
So this is a study trying to make changes in lifestyle, both in respect to eating and exercise. And we're working with children who are at risk for developing type 2 diabetes. So they're overweight. They may have a strong history of type 2 diabetes in their family. Usually there are certain ethnic minorities, such as African Americans, Hispanic in this community, Asian Americans. And what we want to do is to see if through behavior modification, but hook the adolescent into something that they use commonly, and that's the internet or cell phones. And so the idea is that they go to a website on a weekly basis, they log in, and they are then asked to select goals that they're going to make in terms of diet and exercise. And for diet, we use what's called the stoplight diet. So foods are broken down into reds, yellows, and greens. Not the color of the food, but these are not healthy foods.
Okay,
these are better selections to
different
change.
curries.
Different, yes. So even though foods are, peas are green, we also won't get a lot of kids going into that direction. And what we would like to see is when they enter the study, we take an inventory of what their typical diet is and their selections and their preferences. And then at the end of the year to see if we can shift from more out of the reds, more toward the yellows and greens. And then conversely, trying to get them to increase their daily physical activity. So they wear pedometers, they count which keeps track of how many steps they're taking, and the goal is over time that they increase their amount of physical activity. So the behavioral part comes in is that they go on, they log onto a website, they can see, they select their goals. So it's not that we're prescribing what they have to do. They have choices to make based on what their preferences are, which I think is really the only way that you're going to affect change in an individual. And then they get feedback because they see what the changes they made over each week. They get rewards. We use a lot of music downloads because we're dealing with adolescents.
Is there social networking? Do they get to talk to other kids who are living through this at the same time?
So there is, one of the arms not only do they have this internet access, but they come back for sessions with other kids within that same group, and so they interact. And we bring parents too, and so the parents have a piece of this as well. And this again goes back to influences, and certainly from my own clinical experience, I think the children that are most successful losing weight is when we can get the parents to lose weight at the same time. Because if the parent sees changes and they're feeling better about themselves, then they're going to just pull that kid out the door with them and go for a walk with the dog. And that's how we affect change. So when the groups come back together, it's been very interesting to see then, because they share their experiences and see what's successful for them, what's worked for them, what hasn't, what are their challenges, what obstacles do they still have, and how do they perceive themselves.
You started this program before the study that Dr. Fowler had done came out, but you were hitting on the same sort of principles of the influences.
The influences, but I think the influences in his study are even different than what we consider typical influences, because I think certainly with adolescents, peers are very important. This is a time where they're moving away from their parents and trying to develop independence, and so their peer and network is really important. It may not always be, though, they consider all their peers are sort of their best friends, but they survive under this peer pressure. And that's a little bit different than I think what you're describing. But certainly this has to also exist for the adolescents as well. And it's important to realize that so we can tap into that and use that to our advantage.
When I was reading about the PACE program, one of the things that hit me was that the obese adolescent may become antisocial or isolated, and then their social network is reduced to their family, which becomes their influence. And then I started thinking, well, getting their parents to lose weight is obviously important, but their parents aren't going to lose weight unless they have a friend who's influenced, and you start trying to do those dominoes and making them fall of trying to impact all that. You got this kid that you're trying to help who's at risk for diabetes, and you want to get the parents to go, but the parents are going out for barbecue every night with their social group that plays cards together or something, and how do you make those changes? And you start to become a pretty big issue.
I just want to emphasize something about this particular issue. I mean, it certainly is the case that obesity is associated with social isolation. And a lot of people, I think they interpreted the results of our study to be that if you have a friend who becomes obese, that you should stop being friends with them. And that's not at all the message of our study. We studied existing friendships, right? So there's nothing that you can infer from our study about getting rid of a friend or getting a new friend who might have healthy eating behaviors. We looked at the existing network. But there's this huge literature on social support that shows that when you have more friends, you're healthier. You get more support, you feel better about yourself. There are sort of a number of causal mechanisms that cause us to become healthier when we have more friends. And so there was so much kind of controversy on this point with the study that I actually went back to our data and looked to see what happened to people who got rid of friends once they became obese. And
wait, so you actually had the data so if their friend changed weight and gained weight, and then you look back the next visit and they're no longer friends.
That's right.
What happens to them?
It increases the risk of obesity. Yes.
So getting rid of the friend actually increased their risk.
That's right. So on balance, so you may gain something from having a set of friends who are engaged in healthy behaviors, but what you lose from losing the friend is actually much worse. And so the last sort of message you should take from this study is to get rid of any friend.
So the best message might be you and your friend together lose weight.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that a lot of people already understood this, right? I mean, some people reacted to the study, oh, that's really neat, and others reacted, well, duh. I mean, I knew that the best way for me to be able to change my own behaviors is to get my friends and family involved. I mean, you have Weight Watchers in other domains. You have Alcoholics Anonymous. These are groups that have already understood very well that social networks are really the core for a successful change in your lifestyle.
No one had looked at it quite like you had before.
We didn't have the data before, and now we have the data and we can really confirm our intuitions.
So there are a lot of people who spend time watching TV. Often adolescents fall into that category. There are role models that fall into TV. There are from MTV videos to people we see on television. How do we fit that impact into what the social norm is or behavior for people? It's not their friend. I think there are people who sort of think about them that way, but they're not truly friends. Where does that fit, the role of television playing in weight?
Good question. One of the things that our study really indicates is that you have to be very good friends with somebody in order for there to be an effect. So for example, we looked at the effect of immediate neighbors, and there was no effect. And so this could be someone that you actually see frequently, but you're not necessarily very close to them. And if they become obese, it has absolutely no impact on you. Also, this sort of the stronger.
So my neighbors are listening.
That's right. So they can go ahead and eat the extra steak. They can breathe easy. But the idea is that this has to be someone that you're very close to, close friends, close family members. And so the idea that television watching or sort of these relationships on the internet are going to influence us. Seeing models on TV or the thousands of people you're connected to in Facebook. Those people are not going to matter. The people that are going to matter are going to be the people that you're deeply and closely socially connected to.
Can you compare that effect to other effects? In other words, eating habits, activity of lifestyle. Is it all tied in, or is it, is this just one piece of the puzzle?
Well, we certainly expect it to be tied. Actually, you might know a little bit more about this than we do, because we've really just tried to state what the association is between different individuals' weight. I do know that the next thing we're going to be studying is what foods people are eating in this network. And so we just got a grant to do this, and they took a food frequency questionnaire where they asked detailed questions about what people ate. And so just as a tongue-in-cheek example, we drew the banana eating network. How many bananas do you eat a week? But this is going to obviously feed into, we can categorize these foods as green, yellow, and red. I can imagine, green circles, yellow circles, and red circles all sort of connected to each other, and you can see the extent to which good eating behavior or bad eating behavior flows and how it's related to obesity.
And you'd probably predict that those food color networks would match up with the friendship networks in obesity. I mean, that they overlap.
That's certainly what we expect, but that work is yet to be done.
Well, and it goes together with what you're trying to do with PACE and the other work that you do, trying to change that behavior and where to get the lever and to do it.
Yeah. I think, though, what's interesting about their study, again, is that these sort of transitioned over distances. And like you said, you can be 3 or 4 persons removed. So it's a little difficult to imagine that it's going to be just how you eat, because how would that 4th person really know how the first person is eating? It's sort of like the old telephone game when we were younger kids and you whispered it and the message was totally different at the end.
Right.
And so as you start moving down the links, I think that you start to lose some of the effect.
No,
it
absolutely.
has some influence, but I think it still goes back more to, as you're talking about, friendships and how people perceive each other and acceptance of their perception.
And my wife's a runner, and so she's friends with other people who run and who are friends with other people who run, and that seems to, that's the way I looked at it, is that they have common interests that lead them in certain directions. Well, we'll see how it holds up.
That's probably true, and I should emphasize the fact that the effect gets smaller as you get further away. So by the time you're 4 degrees removed, there's not an effect, right? So the strongest ones are the ones we're directly connected to. And so it is like the game of telephone. Eventually, it's just, it's noise.
Right.
So
now, I had a couple of myths that I make sure I wanted to ask you, and you answered 2 of them already. The third one I had was, is obesity contagious? Is it infectious? Or is the idea of obesity what goes on?
I think
is there a virus that they're spreading amongst friends?
I think the ideas are infectious. So we think that this is about norms. And so one other aspect of the study that was really interesting is that when we looked at friends who were thousands of miles away versus friends who lived very close, the effect was pretty much the same size. And so this to us indicates that it's not because we're going running with a friend or we're eating with a friend. These are really about us exchanging ideas about what healthy eating and healthy exercise behavior is and what a healthy lifestyle is. I mean, these are people that you could see once a year, and they still have a tremendous effect on who you are.
It's very impressive when we talk about it this way. He's getting grants to do all this. He's getting a lot of money to do all this. How important is it that we talk about obesity and weight?
Well, it's tremendous because it's the change in the prevalence of obesity has just been staggering in the United States. The prevalence has doubled to tripled in certain populations. Certainly adults now, 60%, over 2/3 of people are considered to be overweight and a third are obese, and the children's prevalence are just trailing behind. They're just about a decade beyond that. And as you're well aware, there are so many medical complications to obesity. So starting from developing insulin resistance and causing potentially increased risk of type 2 diabetes. As a pediatric endocrinologist, when I started 17 years ago, I never saw a child with type 2, which we typically associate with adults. Now 25% of the children we see with new onset have type 2 diabetes.
And that's really related to weight.
It's really related to weight because this has changed too rapidly to be a genetic influence. It's clearly an environmental influence and change. It's estimated right now, for example, that every child that's born today, if the prevalence of obesity continues at its current escalating rate, that a third of those individuals will develop diabetes by the time they're adults.
Wow.
A third. So there are quite staggering figures. And not only do we see it in terms of the realm of diabetes, but children are developing a disease or fatty infiltration in the liver, and that can actually go on to develop cirrhosis. And so there's a much higher prevalence of this disorder now. We see a lot of orthopedic problems because of obesity. Sleep apnea is another significant problem that we're seeing. And this is just being parlayed into the adult world as well.
Now you're doing some other work on smoking and drinking and happiness.
Yeah. So smoking, we just submitted a paper, and one of the interesting things there is you can look at the cluster sizes of smokers. So how many smokers are sort of connected to each other. The incidence of smoking has dramatically decreased over the last 30 years. So in some sense, it's sort of the mirror image of the obesity epidemic. But the size of these clusters has remained the same, the average size. What that means, if those two things are happening at once, is that whole groups of people are quitting together. And so this is sort of the main sort of interesting point is that it's not people sort of at the edge of a social network that are quitting. It's whole groups of people, one person quits and then everybody in the group quits.
But that's proof of concept in essence of the PACE program and these other programs being able to get groups together to make an impact, reversing that effect.
Right, assuming that the same mechanisms work for smoking as they do for obesity. Yeah, we hope that that's the case.
Yeah, and as a doctor, again, is there anything good about smoking?
Not that I can think of.
There's nothing good about smoking. And is there anything good about being obese? No. I mean, these are lifestyle changes. These are things that people can do for themselves. If you came to a physician, somebody came to your office and there was things you could do to help them lose weight and you didn't, they'd be furious with you. Yet there are things that people can get involved themselves to make a difference. And smoking is like that. Obesity is like that. And if these networks continue to hold up that way, you may have helped us identify, and you've already been working in that world, but even sharpen our tools to influence those networks to get positive behaviors.
I certainly hope so. I mean, that's a big motivation of mine. I have members of my family who are afflicted with obesity, and I would love it if something that I did, so often it's up in the sky, but if something I did actually had a positive impact on their lives, I would just be thrilled.
So you have to take a moment and tell us about the happiness study.
Okay, yeah. So we also are studying happiness, and so they gave this depression questionnaire to individuals in the Framingham Heart Study, and part of that questionnaire are several questions on happiness. And what we're finding there is that happiness spreads from person to person as well. And this is really interesting because we already know that there are these short-term effects of happiness. So if I smile, it increases the chances that you'll smile, and vice versa. It is locally contagious. But there have been these other studies that show that happiness is fleeting. And so, for example, if you win the lottery, you'll increase the amount of happiness that you have for about a year. But then after that, you're just as happy or unhappy as you were before you won all the money.
Because you spent all the money by then.
Perhaps, right, yeah. But it's interesting because you sort of think that, if only I can just have $1 million, I'll be set. And as it turns out, it's fleeting. And the interesting thing is that we find that these exams that happen every 2 to 4 years indicate that over the long term, that whenever your friend becomes happier, it increases your own happiness.
Well, that's amazing. So we have about 2 minutes left in the show, and I wanted to give you a chance to talk about how, if you could control the world in the future, taking some of these principles, the PACE study that you've been working on, the networking that we're talking about, how would we impact schools, public health? Where do you see this going one day?
Well, I think certainly schools are a great place for us to have an impact because they give us, first of all, an educational opportunity, and there have been some unique programs already developed for schools. We can't just take the attitude that, well, we can explain that you're overweight, you have to make these changes, and you're going to do it. But if we tried to do it more from an educational point of view, it's explain to why should you make healthy choices, and here are examples. And then let the schools be an environment where they can make a healthy choice. It's kind of silly for us to talk about making healthy choices, and then they can go buy soda or they can buy Flaming Hot Cheetos from the vending machines to do that. So, and if we're going to affect the change in the house, this is a great place to make it a change. Because if the child comes home and says, "Well, I really like getting apples. I don't want to eat the Fritos that you're giving me all the time, potato chips." Then maybe we can affect a change within the house as well. So understanding, and I think certainly the study you were just talking about with the smokers quitting in a cluster is very encouraging because it does give weight to the evidence that we need to maybe think about these networks and attack a network as opposed to just looking at an individual to do that. And we see that all the time again in children. We can't just say to a family where everybody in the family is obese and we were just talking about the 8-year-old child and say, okay, you have to make a change, and the other family members are allowed to continue to do whatever they were doing before. You'll have no success at all.
Well, that's neat. This is exciting, and I'm so glad both of you could come join us to talk about this because it's of just interest anyway, but it has impact on people's lives and health. And whether you know it or not, you've already impacted people and changed their health as a political scientist. That's what doctors do, okay? It's what MD doctors do, not the PhD doctors do. So, I mean, congratulations on an incredible study, and I know that you're going to be continuing to work on this, and I think that's just spectacular. And thank you for coming to talk to us about how important all this is and how meaningful it is.
Thank you.
Appreciate you both spending time with us. You've just heard an incredible discussion about the impact that your social network, which includes your friends, but for kids, their family network, what that can have on your life and health. And the trick isn't to get rid of your friends who you don't like a habit, like if they're obese, because that doesn't work. We know that. But remember that you do have influence and that you can change, and that actually can help the people around you as well. So let's take advantage of these networks and flip them. Knowledge is power. The more you know, the more you can affect your own health, and as it turns out, the health of your friends and your family. I'm Dr. David Granite. This has been Health Matters. We'll see you again next time.